welcome everybody. Keep yourselves on mute. Just while I welcome everybody here. My name's Lawrence Underwood from FD Recruit. We set up these webinars just for you guys to support our network of FDs and CFOs with lots of different topics. This one's proving particularly useful, I think. So it's just a support group for you guys. What I'll do is I'll introduce the speaker in a second. The speaker will then do their 20 minutes or so, let them do their presentation. Any questions that you think you may have, I think the best way, because there's so many people on the call, it's very difficult to work out who's going to want to say what and when, and people talking over each other. So if you can just send me a message through the chat, there's a chat icon at the bottom of the screen. If you just want to ask a question on that, write it down, then I can ask the question to Miles at the end, and we'll do the questions at the end. But if I do that, and then it saves, you know, everybody talking over each other, just because there's so many of you, and it'd be nice to just get as many questions done as we can. So just to let you know, obviously FD Recruit, that's myself. We set these up for you guys. Any particular topics that you think you need, by all means, let me know at any point after this, you know, connect with me on LinkedIn, whatever. I just want to support you guys with stuff that mainly you don't see every day or not particularly used to every day, but need some help on it. So just give me a shout anytime you like. But for this one today, it's an important topic. I think a lot is going on in businesses. FDs potentially have to deal with it, but not necessarily know a lot about it. So it's there to support you. So today's presentation is implementing ESG strategies across your business, presented thankfully by Miles Barnes. Thank you so much, Howes Percival. I really appreciate your time on this. And yeah, just any questions, send them through to me. But before we start, just quickly, there's quite a few people still not got the cameras on. It'd be nice to see everybody just for the interaction for Miles, so he can kind of see everybody as he's doing his presentation. So if you're stuck, start video at the bottom left. Be nice to see everybody. But welcome today to all of you. Thank you for turning up, and especially to Miles Barnes at Howes Percival for today's presentation. Miles, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Lawrence. Right, so this is the moment of truth, whether the slides will appear. Hopefully everyone can see that. So yeah, as Lawrence mentioned, I think this is a fairly hot topic at the moment, ESG, but it's also a fairly nebulous one as well. It's one of those business concepts that everybody started throwing around, but perhaps isn't especially well defined. And if it's something that you're new to, or that in your position is just starting to come across your desk, or you've got shareholders asking about it, you've got your board asking, what are we doing around this? Or maybe you're looking at funding arrangements and actually your banker asking about this, because that's certainly becoming more and more prevalent over the last couple of years. It can be a bit of a tricky topic to get started with, really. So, because we've got a fairly short amount of time today, what I wanted to do was particularly focus on the practical steps you could take. I'm not going to go into the intricacies of environmental legislation. I'm sure you'll all be happy to know. It's very much practical steps that you in your roles might be asked to take to really start to get a handle on these issues, how they impact the business, and what you can do proactively about them. So before we do, as I say, ESG is a fairly poorly defined concept, but essentially it stands for environmental, social, and governance issues, covering a whole range of things from mandatory legal requirements through to best practice, or even sort of societal expectations. And it's really about trying to do business in a slightly more responsible way than perhaps has been done historically. It's not the sort of area that is a sort of tick box exercise, I'm afraid, and it's very much not a one size fits all. This is a broad range of multiple topics, and you sort of have to pick and choose what the key ones are for your business and go with those. So in practice, now, the one thing that I get asked about more than anything else with ESG is, can we just do a policy? And everyone loves a policy for a compliance issue, I know, and it can absolutely be part of the solution, but there is no nice, neat policy for this sort of area, unfortunately. It's a range of things, and what you need to do will depend on your business and where you are and where you want to get to. So, implementing ESG. First step is to make an assessment of where your business is at the moment. It may be actually an area you're already quite far along and you're really trying to refine specific details. It may be you've never thought about these things in any great detail and you're starting from scratch. Either way, it's good to do an assessment of where you are first. And the thing I recommend people do with this is to use the B Corp impact assessment tool, which is available online. Now, some of you may have heard about B Corps and been asked about being a B Corp. Some of you may work in B Corps. That's really a certification of sort of ESG best practice in a lot of areas. But whether that's of interest or not, the online assessment tool is really good as a bit of an overview of the various different aspects and getting a feel for where you are at the moment, what's good, what's bad, and maybe some recommendations of what to do going forwards. I would also, on top of that assessment, talk to the teams in the business, particularly sales, procurement, HR, marketing, ask them what they're seeing at the moment. What are customers talking about? What are suppliers requiring of the business? Are we meeting those needs already within the industry? Or if we're not, where are the gaps that we need to fill? Once you've done that initial assessment, then it's about prioritizing. Because as I say, this is a huge topic with a wide range of areas. And it's unrealistic if you've not looked at any of them before to expect to cover everything, or certainly not to cover everything properly. So look at the areas, decide what's most important, usually based on the sector, the industry, or the size of business you're in. So just for a few examples, so if I was in the construction industry, I would start with bribery. The Bribery Act's been around for a very long time, and I would hope most businesses are already up to speed with it. But we increasingly find people that aren't, including businesses that come to sell and realize there are some gaps there. And even though we like to think bribery doesn't really happen, it is still quite prevalent in aspects of the construction industry in terms of things like bid rigging. So that's where I would start. If I were looking at food and drink, I would be much more focused on supply chain and where our supply chain goes and making sure that at each stage, there are no aspects of modern slavery, human trafficking, or any other key compliance risks. That can be a tricky process depending on what your supply chain looks like. So I've got a client that recently had to go to Argentina to look at some farms as part of their supply chain due diligence. But it could be really simple if actually you've only got a handful of suppliers that are all in the UK. And just as a third example, if I was in something like the packaging industry, my first focus would very much be on environmental issues. Where's our paper coming from? What inks are we using? What are the expectations from our customer base in terms of product makeup and environmental standards? So that's step 2. Step 3 is to start the implementation of best practice. Now, this again will depend on which of those areas you choose to focus on. And it's very much not a one size fits all. One aspect may be introducing policies. Again, there are some standard ones that I expect most businesses to have. So things like a bribery policy, an environmental policy. Nowadays, most businesses, particularly larger ones, have got some kind of modern slavery statement. That can absolutely be part of the puzzle. Training is the next step. Now, again, this is where I think sometimes people will stop at that policy point. Training is you're building off the policies in part. So again, your classic training on things like bribery, data protection, quality and diversity, but also think a bit more creatively here. What about if you're in a consumer goods business, for example, some training for your marketing team on greenwashing and actually the dangers of making environmental claims in your marketing literature would be far more beneficial than just rolling out the same training that you do to tick the compliance box. So get a bit creative and explore what's out there. The next thing is, again, it's quite broad, but better procedures. So not just policies, but actually what's happening on the ground. So if you're really focusing on environmental aspects, what can we do within the production line to make sure actually we're reducing carbon, we're reducing paper, we're trying to use more recyclable materials, whatever it may be, actually trying to implement that on the ground day to day, because that's really the change that should last. And then finally, and I'm a lawyer, so forgive me, this hadn't had to be in here, but looking at contracts, looking at standard terms, looking at how you engage with your suppliers and your customers to see, A, if actually you're complying with your requirements already. So increasingly, we're seeing people being asked to sign up to supplier codes of conduct, to a whole host of policy requirements from big customers or big suppliers, to due diligence reporting requirements. All of this is expanding. So are you meeting your existing obligations? But then also, are you properly covering yourselves the other way? So if you've got obligations from a customer, are you making sure those are flowing down to your subcontractors? So you're not bearing extra risk within your business that should actually be spread across the supply chain. And then the final part of that sort of legal review, if you like, is really about having a better understanding what risks we should and shouldn't take. And the classic here is the policy acceptance negotiation, which I'm having on an increasing number of supply chain contracts at the moment. Should we accept their policies? Because everybody will ask you to. Should we say no? And what's our policy and what's our position on that? And also other areas. So if you're being asked whether you use only recyclable materials and you don't, what's the response to that question? So again, all of those steps can be quite time intensive, I'm not going to lie, and there can be cost implications to it. So I would start small, focus on those prioritized areas, and then once you start to implement those, then you can go a bit broader. And the final step I'd recommend is just ongoing review. Now, this doesn't mean that every month at a board meeting, you've got to talk about your ESG steps or your ESG compliance, but maybe it's once a year, maybe it's every 18 months. Just generally try to keep an eye on things because this is a really fast moving area. More and more legislation is coming in. As the government works out what it's doing in terms of post-Brexit legislation, I'd expect a lot of movement because a lot of these legal requirements, where they are statutory, are going to change in the next couple of years. So just once you've taken those initial steps, just try to keep things under review, try to make sure you're staying up to date with best practice. But it will take time. If you really want to commit to these sorts of areas, it does take time and it is complicated. And as you'll all know, implementing changes in a business is never an easy thing. So just accept that, prioritize, and then just take those first initial steps and go from there. So just generally, ESG is a hot topic now, but I don't think that's going away. I don't think this is something that's going to be a bit fly by night. It really is reflective of wider changes in society, wider expectations from employees, from stakeholders. The climate change agenda obviously is a huge part of this, and I don't think that's going to go away. And if anything, I would expect more regulation on some of these areas. On top of that, anyone who's dealing with consumers or ultimately has individual consumers at the end of their supply chain, consumers are getting more selective on these areas. I think sometimes that can be overstated a little bit, but definitely consumers are picking businesses based on their environmental credentials, or at least claimed credentials in a lot of areas now. So it's going to be a commercial issue as well as a legal and a compliance one. And actually, the sooner you can take some initial steps, the further ahead and better positioned you're going to be longer term. And again, because I know you're all finance people, banks, funders, VC investors, they are all looking at this stuff as well. If you don't have any environmental covenants in financing you've got now, I wouldn't be surprised if you will over the next few years if you come to finance or refinance anything. We're seeing more and more green debt facilities and more emphasis on this by the banks as well. So one way or another, there's going to be an expectation that every business is taking steps to be more compliant. That was it from me. So I'll pass back to Lawrence, but very happy to answer any questions that anybody's got. Oh, you're on mute.
I am. Thank you, Mars. Really appreciate it. If you can get yourself off sharing the screen so I can see everybody, that'd be great.
Yeah.
And then I haven't had any questions been typed in yet. So I'm just wondering, has anybody got any questions for Mars that he can field now? If not, Obviously, you can catch up with him if you want to do it personally or privately afterwards. But anybody got any questions now? If so, some of you might have to speak up because I can't see you because some people are not on the camera. But anybody got any questions for now for Miles?
Hi, I was just very quickly, just some indications of what the measures might be coming in. Is there a broad brush? These are the top three they ask in terms of governance and things, because we all are coming up with our own targets. But it would be interesting to know, is there a pattern from investors and things like that?
That's interesting. So in terms of top things that are likely to come in, I suspect you will see a lot of changes around mostly things like, I think, environmental standards. There's already quite a bit of legislation on that already. I think already the government has changed things like modern slavery legislation in the last 12 months. Obviously, as I'm sure many of you know, they are looking at taxing some of these areas as a means. So the packaging tax that's come in recently, that's a prime example. So I wouldn't be surprised to see, particularly depending what happens politically over the next couple of years, I wouldn't be surprised if it's a combination of more specific taxes on areas. We've seen the sugar tax, we've seen the packaging tax. The government is using that as a weapon effectively on things they don't like. I would expect a lot more on environmental standards generally, perhaps more mandatory compliance rather than we'd like you to do this. We've seen that very specifically on things like deforestation, but I think that will get broader. And then I think the other piece probably, which has been mooted for a good few years, is more around the HR piece actually, around things like greater employee engagement. There's been talk about having mandatory employee representation on boards, things like that. That's a piece that doesn't get reported as much as part of ESG, but actually I think is the sort of area that may well get looked at again, particularly depending on what happens politically in the next year or two.
Thanks, Miles. Anybody else got anything specific that they'd like to ask Miles? Now they've got him on call. Anything else from anybody? Or having one question here, if you can see it in the chat box. But essentially, Ian's asked, having dealt with the NHS for many years, who are very demanding as far as reporting, I'd say there's a big difference between the administrative burden on companies and what they're actually doing from a practical perspective. Anything to add on?
I think that's probably a very good summary, not just of the NHS, to be honest. Be careful what I say. We're a government contractor as well. But yeah, I think that's true. And actually, I think that's true of a lot of large corporates as well. They are imposing policies and that are enormous and wide-ranging and either irrelevant or over the top for most companies to actually comply with. So anyone that's ever dealt with Amazon will get a very blunt policy response in return. And I think that's true. And actually, one of the things that I don't have a great answer for this, if I'm honest, Ian, but as much as possible, you try and argue with reason based on, look, this is what's actually happening in the real world. And that's an argument I have a lot with people trying to impose reporting standards or policies that they can't meet. But I think if you can't do that, you do the best you can, and you have to just be aware going into these things that there will be a risk gap between what's written down and what's actually realistic. And you just have to be aware of what that risk gap is. And some people won't move on these things because they feel like they're ticking the box by just passing the risk down to their suppliers, unfortunately.
Brilliant. It sounds like a fledgling area in which people will probably need your help a bit more, Miles. So yeah, it's one that I think people will realise when they come across it, and perhaps a bit difficult to foresee. And obviously, because it's so new, it's evolving all the time as well. So it's quite hard. How do you keep up with it? Just quickly, how do you keep up with it all?
Well, it's part of what I'm paid to do, which helps. But also, I think it is difficult to keep up. And I think that exercise of understanding what the big areas are for your business really helps. So I work with a lot of clients across a whole range of industries. So I get to see that variety and what the real pinch points are, or what the things people really care about are. But if you're in the business, I think just understand where they are, both from a sort of risk management perspective, but also from an opportunity perspective.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. There's one more there. Martin Little. Can you see that one, Miles?
Yes. That's an interesting one on NEC contracts, actually, because obviously because they're an industry-wide standard form, nobody likes to tinker around with them too much. But I wouldn't be surprised if some of the real major main contractors do start to perhaps have their own Z clauses and their own variations, which apply some things, or separately maybe try and apply some standards. I've seen it on a couple of subcontracts recently where people have had separate, more in the procurement process, actually, they've effectively said, you also have to do this, 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 and this if you want to sign up and be a subcontractor on this project. So I don't, as far as I'm aware, there aren't any plans to introduce them into the standard NEC contract, anything new into the standard NEC contracts at the moment. But I wouldn't be surprised eventually if something becomes sort of standard practice, or more and more people adopt it voluntarily, that then it will get introduced at some point. But I think construction's one of those areas where it takes time because everybody's operating on those standard forms. It's just going to take more time probably than some other areas, I would have thought.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Look, if there's no more questions, I think that's either because people have all the answers, Miles, which I think maybe you've done your job and informed everybody, or perhaps they have something a bit more specific that they may not think other people would be interested in. So by all means, look, that's the point of this. If you need anything from Miles, get in touch with him directly. You can find him on LinkedIn or the Howes Percival website, and just any questions, fire them at him. At the end of this presentation, I shall put just a little link on LinkedIn. So if you need to refer back to the presentation at any point, you can grab it from there. So it's all there for you. I'll link everybody that's on the call today so that they can find it easily enough. But look, if there's no more questions, Miles, thank you so much for today. Really appreciate it. Thank you for everybody for turning up. Hope you found it useful. And yes, thank you so much again, and have a great afternoon. Thank you, everybody.